It was the kind of moment that doesn't just make headlines, it burns itself into memory. In a chamber thick with the quiet hum of cameras, under the unforgiving glare of bright white lights, Sarah Huckabee Sanders snapped. The governor, who prided herself on composure, who had built a career on spinning narratives with a smile, suddenly lost control. Her voice cracked with anger, her words tangled in frustration. For the first time in years, the mask slipped into America, saw the hypocrisy laid bare. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett sat steady, eyes locked on Sanders with the calm patience of someone who had seen storms before and never flinched. No shouting, no frantic gestures, just quiet, razor-sharp resolve. Crockett's silence was not empty, it was weight, it was presence. And in that silence, the contrast between the two women became undeniable. Arrogance unraveling against dignity, unshaken. The air in the room shifted. Journalists leaned forward, pens frozen mid-note. A ripple of disbelief crossed the faces in the crowd. Was this really happening? Was the once untouchable Sanders actually coming undone? Not in private whispers or leaked stories, but right there, in front of the cameras, before the nation's eyes. Sanders tried to claw her way back to control, lashing out with defiance. But the harder she fought, the more obvious it became. This wasn't strength, it was desperation. Crockett didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to match fury with fury. Her restraint was the very blade cutting Sanders apart. And for viewers watching at home, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. On one side, the old politics of bluster, entitlement, and double standards. On the other, a new voice, rooted in truth, unwilling to bow, unwilling to be silenced. It was more than an argument. It was a collision of eras, a reminder that hypocrisy, no matter how confidently it is performed, cannot withstand the steady light of honesty. The room fell silent for one suspended second, a silence louder than any outburst. Then came the chaos, questions, murmurs, tweets firing off in real time. And yet, amid the noise, one truth cut through. A line had been crossed, and Sanders could never walk it back. But to understand why this moment hit so hard, we need to rewind. To grasp why this confrontation mattered, you have to see the battlefield it unfolded on. This wasn't just a verbal sparring match. It was a collision shaped by years of political tension, sharpened by culture wars, and ignited by the deepening divide over who gets to define truth in America. Sarah Huckabee Sanders had stepped into her governorship with a mission, to present herself as a torchbearer of family values, a leader who claimed to speak for tradition, morality, and strength. Every press conference, every carefully staged event, was designed to reinforce that image. But beneath the polished slogans lurked contradictions, policies that undermined the very values she claimed to champion. Statements that collapsed under the weight of her own record. For months, those contradictions simmered just below the surface. Then came Jasmine Crockett, the freshman congresswoman from Texas who refused to play along. Crockett wasn't in Washington to be polite, to smile and nod while hypocrisy went unchecked. She brought with her a trial lawyer's instinct for exposing contradictions and a voice sharpened by years of fighting for clients no one else wanted to represent. In hearings, she had already built a reputation as someone unafraid to look power in the eye and say, "That doesn't add up." The clash between these two figures was inevitable. On one side, Sanders, the embodiment of establishment privilege, wielding her father's legacy, the weight of her party, and the confidence of someone who had always been shielded by political power. On the other, Crockett, daughter of the South, shaped by struggle, carrying herself with the unapologetic clarity of someone who knows the stakes are bigger than personal reputation. And America was watching. The timing couldn't have been more critical. In state houses and in Congress, debates over identity, justice, and equality were raging hotter than ever. Sanders positioned herself as a defender of real America, but her definition excluded millions whose voices were rising louder each year. Crockett represented that rising tide: immigrants, young progressives, working families, people of color who refused to be erased from the national story. That's what made this confrontation more than theater. It was symbolism made flesh. When Crockett pressed Sanders, she wasn't just asking questions, she was holding up a mirror, reflecting every contradiction Sanders wanted to hide. When Sanders lashed out, it wasn't just personal irritation, it was the system itself buckling under the pressure of being exposed. For viewers at home, the tension wasn't abstract, it was visceral. People saw themselves in the faces of the two women. To some, Sanders represented the shield of privilege and inherited power. To others, Crockett embodied resilience, the courage to demand answers even when the odds seemed stacked. And in that moment, Americans weren't just watching politicians, they were watching a larger story about who this country belongs to. The weight of that realization is why the chamber's silence after Sanders lost, it felt so deafening. It was more than embarrassment for one politician. It was the unmistakable sound of a narrative cracking open. For those who had grown weary of spin and hypocrisy, it was vindication. For those who built careers on avoiding accountability, it was a warning shot. This was no random eruption. This was a spark struck on years of dry tinder, a moment that couldn't be dismissed or forgotten. And the hypocrisy, Crockett called out. It wasn't random, it was years in the making. To understand why Sarah Huckabee Sanders unraveled under Jasmine Crockett's pressure, we need to step back and look at the arc of her political journey, a story less about leadership and more about the careful cultivation of an image. Sarah Huckabee Sanders grew up steeped in politics. Her father, Mike Huckabee, was governor of Arkansas, a preacher politician who blended folksy charm with conservative conviction. From the start, Sarah learned that proximity to power could be as influential as power itself. She didn't have to claw her way into the spotlight, it was handed to her like an inheritance. And with that privilege came a shield, the assurance that mistakes could be smoothed over, that criticism could be brushed aside, that legacy would carry her farther than merit alone. Her rise onto the national stage came not as an elected official, but as a spokesperson and defender of Donald Trump in one of the most chaotic White Houses in modern history. As press secretary, Sanders became synonymous with the art of deflection. Day after day, she stood at the podium and spun untruths into half-truths, contradictions into talking points. She mastered the tight smile and the firm denial. Even when evidence was stacked high and undeniable, she would double down, projecting certainty that left critics fuming and supporters cheering. It was in those press briefings that her political persona crystallized, unflinching, unyielding, unapologetic. But beneath that armor lay a pattern, contradictions that piled up like stones. She railed against fake news, yet routinely delivered statements that later had to be corrected. She preached about morality and family values while defending policies that tore families apart at the border. She claimed to represent ordinary Americans but never hesitated to wield privilege as a weapon. When she returned to Arkansas and launched her campaign for governor, Sanders carried those same contradictions home. Her stump speeches painted her as a champion of freedom, but her policies narrowed the definition of who counted as free. She positioned herself as a defender of parents while pushing measures that marginalized children from immigrant and minority backgrounds. She declared herself a protector of truth while building her platform on distortions of reality. And yet, for a time, it worked. The machinery of politics insulated her. The friendly media circuits reinforced her narrative. The loyalty of her base kept her shielded from accountability. Sanders perfected the performance of certainty in a world that craved clarity, no matter how shaky the foundation beneath it. But contradictions have a way of catching up. When Crockett pressed Sanders, she wasn't inventing a new critiques, she was drawing on years of accumulated hypocrisy. Every time Sanders defended a lie at the White House podium, every time she leaned on her father's name while denying the privileges that brought her to power, every time she claimed the mantle of moral authority while undermining the very people she insisted she was serving, it all hung in the air between them, invisible to some, glaring to others. And that's why the confrontation struck so deep. Sanders wasn't just being challenged on one comment, one policy, one mistake. She was being confronted with the sum total of a career built on contradictions. Crockett, with her lawyers' precision, cracked the surface. And once the surface cracked, the whole structure trembled. The irony is that Sanders had built her brand on the idea of unflappable strength. Her supporters praised her as someone who could face hostile questions and never lose composure. But strength built on spin has limits. When confronted with truth that cuts too deep, the mask slips, and once it slips, you can't put it back on without everyone noticing the tear. For years, Sanders had been shielded by her party, her family name, and the machinery of political loyalty. But Crockett offered no such deference. She didn't treat Sanders like a figure to tiptoe around. She treated her like what she was, a public official accountable for her words and actions. That was the breaking point. Viewers who knew Sanders' history recognized it instantly. This wasn't just another politician getting flustered. This was the collapse of an image long held up as invulnerable. The same woman who once sparred with reporters and emerged seemingly unshaken was suddenly, visibly rattled. The contradictions she had carried for years had finally become too heavy to bear. But while Sanders was doubling down on her contradictions, a rising voice from Texas was preparing for this exact moment. If Sarah Huckabee Sanders represented entitlement and inheritance, Jasmine Crockett represented grit and determination. Her story didn't begin in the polished halls of privilege, it began in classrooms, courtrooms, and neighborhoods where justice often felt like a distant promise. To understand why Crockett's presence shook Sanders so deeply, you have to understand what forged her. Jasmine Crockett grew up in the South, a region where history weighs heavily, and identity is never neutral. From the start, she knew what it meant to stand out, to be questioned, to have to prove herself twice over in rooms where others were granted the benefit of the doubt. But instead of bending under that weight, she turned it into fuel. She learned early that the world wasn't fair, and that if you wanted fairness, you had to fight for it. That fight carried her to law school, where she didn't just study the system, she dissected it. While some classmates dreamed of corporate salaries and corner offices, Crockett set her sights on the people too often ignored. Those without power, without money, without a voice. She built her career as a defense attorney, representing the vulnerable against forces much larger than themselves. Each case was more than paperwork. It was a test of resilience, a battle between dignity and disregard, and she learned quickly how to cross-examine not just witnesses, but the very assumptions the system was built on. In the courtroom, Crockett honed her craft. Her style wasn't flashy. It was surgical. She knew when to press, when to hold back, when silence could pierce louder than words. She wasn't there to entertain. She was there to expose the truth, and truth, wielded properly, can be devastating. When she transitioned into politics, Crockett carried that same courtroom intensity with her. In Texas, she earned a reputation as a legislator who wouldn't be cowed, who refused to shrink herself to fit into the mold of polite politics. She was unapologetically direct, unflinching in her values, and relentless in her pursuit of accountability. While others maneuvered, carefully choosing their words to avoid backlash, Crockett knew that silence was its own kind of complicity. That clarity made her stand out in Washington. In committee hearings, where grandstanding is the norm, she cut through noise with precision. When colleagues tried to interrupt or dismiss her, she didn't raise her voice in anger, she raised it in insistence. Every sentence carried the weight of someone who had spent years defending people who couldn't defend themselves. For many viewers, she became a symbol, proof that honesty, delivered with dignity, could still cut through the static of politics as usual. Her rise wasn't accidental, it was earned. She wasn't handed a platform by legacy or inheritance. She built it through persistence and courage. And in doing so, she resonated with a new generation of Americans who were tired of watching arrogance go unchallenged. Immigrants, working-class families, young activists, and marginalized communities saw in Crockett what they longed to see in politics. Someone unafraid to say what others only whispered. That's why her confrontation with Sanders carried such weight. This wasn't just a politician challenging another politician. It was a clash of lived realities. Sanders, polished by privilege and insulated by connections, versus Crockett, sharpened by struggle and sustained by principle. When Crockett looked Sanders in the eye, she wasn't staring at a rival, she was staring at the embodiment of every contradiction she had fought against her entire life. And there was something else, something Sanders couldn't compete with: authenticity. Crockett didn't need to posture or pretend. She didn't need to hide behind talking points crafted by consultants. Her authority didn't come from a last name or a family legacy. It came from the scars of experience, from the clients she had defended, from the nights spent preparing for cases when no one believed she could win. That authenticity was Crockett's shield and sword. And it was precisely what made Sanders' unraveling inevitable. Because when arrogance collides with authenticity, arrogance almost always breaks first. For Sanders, the confrontation may have been just another day of political sparring. But for Crockett, it was more. It was a continuation of everything she had always done, holding powerful people accountable, refusing to let hypocrisy pass unchallenged, standing tall in rooms where she was never meant to belong. Her composure wasn't calculated, it was muscle memory, built over years of fighting uphill battles and refusing to back down. And so, when the cameras rolled and Sanders cracked under pressure, Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her very presence was enough. She had already proven what mattered, that dignity could stand firm against bluster, that truth could outlast spin, that someone without the shield of privilege could still dismantle power with nothing more than clarity and courage. It was the collision of two worlds, one built on entitlement, one built on endurance. And when the two worlds collided, one of spin, one of truth, the stage was set for fireworks. The atmosphere in the chamber shifted the moment the exchange began. It wasn't just another routine sparring match. It felt like the opening bell of a heavyweight fight. On one side stood Sarah Huckabee Sanders, chin high, her words carrying that familiar air of smug certainty. On the other, Jasmine Crockett, poised, unhurried, her tone measured like a surgeon preparing for an incision. The contrast was striking. Sanders' confidence radiated like armor, but Crockett's calm radiated like a weapon. Sanders began with the same playbook she had carried for years. She brushed aside pointed questions, smirked at criticisms, and tried to cast herself as the adult in the room. Every word she spoke was laced with the implication that she was untouchable, that Crockett was out of her depth. She leaned on sarcasm, on dismissive tones, on the subtle suggestion that her opponent simply didn't understand how politics worked. But Crockett didn't bite. She didn't rush. Instead, she listened closely, intently, like a chess player, watching an opponent make predictable moves. Each time Sanders attempted to dismiss her, Crockett's responses were precise. She wasn't swinging wildly, she was setting traps, one by one. And the more patient Crockett was, the more frustrated Sanders grew. The room itself felt the tension building. Each exchange landed heavier than the last. Observers shifted in their seats, sensing that something extraordinary was brewing. Sanders' voice grew sharper, her interruptions more frequent. Crockett remained unflappable. She didn't just answer Sanders, she exposed the hollowness in the way Sanders answered her. It began to resemble a boxing match in slow motion. Sanders threw jabs of ridicule, hoping to rattle Crockett, but each jab glanced off. Crockett, in turn, delivered steady body shots, small factual corrections, sharp legal observations, subtle reminders of Sanders' inconsistencies. Sanders had expected a shouting match she could dominate with volume. Instead, she found herself trapped in a battle of patience, where her temper was her weakness, and Crockett's composure was her strength. With every minute, Sanders' frustration became harder to disguise. Her facial expressions betrayed the irritation beneath the practiced confidence. She leaned harder on talking points, repeating herself, hoping repetition would mask the lack of substance. But Crockett didn't let go. She pressed with quiet insistence, her voice unwavering, her questions precise, leaving less and less room for Sanders to maneuver. And then came the tipping point. Sanders, cornered by the persistence, lashed out, with sharper words, louder tone, trying to overwhelm the moment with force, but in doing so, she crossed a line she couldn't uncross. What was meant to project strength instead revealed weakness, her composure breaking in real time. For those watching, it was electric. The energy of the chamber shifted completely. The once assured Sanders looked rattled, her usual controls slipping. Crockett hadn't raised her voice, hadn't broken her calm, but she had turned Sanders' own strategy against her. With each measured question, each steady response, she pushed Sanders closer to the edge. It was no longer just about policy, it was about poise. One woman was unraveling, the other was immovable, and everyone watching knew something monumental was about to happen. And then, Crockett delivered the line that no one saw coming. It happened in a heartbeat, yet it felt like time slowed. Sanders had just finished another dismissive jab, her tone dripping with the same condescension that had carried her through so many confrontations. She leaned back, smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth, as though the match were already won. That was the moment Jasmine Crockett struck. Her voice was calm, even so calm, it cut deeper than a shout ever could. "Governor Sanders," she began, her eyes locked, her tone measured. "You talk about integrity, but your own record tells a very different story." The chamber went still. Crockett didn't rush. She let the silence stretch, let the weight of her opening words hang in the air like a storm cloud. Sanders shifted in her seat, eyes narrowing, but Crockett was just beginning. "You defended policies that ripped families apart at the border," she continued, each phrase like a scalpel. "And then you called yourself a defender of family values. You called the media dishonest, yet you admitted under oath that you spread false information from the White House podium. You claim to stand for freedom, yet your policies strip it away from the very people you're supposed to serve." A murmur rippled through the room. It wasn't outrage, it was recognition. Everyone present knew Crockett wasn't improvising. She had receipts, Sanders tried to interject, but Crockett held up a hand, steady and firm, not with anger, but with authority. "No, Governor," she said quietly, her tone carrying more force than a yell. "This is not your press room. This is not your stage. This is accountability." That was the moment the tide shifted. Sanders had been rattled before, but now her composure began to crack. Her voice wavered as she tried to defend herself, leaning on the old crutches of fake news and partisan bias. But the more she spoke, the weaker it sounded. The room wasn't buying it, and neither was Crockett. Crockett pressed forward, her cadence slow and deliberate, giving each revelation room to breathe. "You inherited power. I built mine. You spin narratives to protect yourself. I fight for people who don't have protection. You call hypocrisy leadership. I call it what it is, fraud." The word landed like a hammer, fraud. It echoed in the silence that followed, the kind of silence that swallows even the faintest. Coughs and whispers. Sanders blinked, her lips parting, but no words came fast enough to fill the void. And then came the moment that would replay endlessly across social media. Crockett leaned forward, her tone softer now, almost compassionate but cutting all the same. "Governor, the truth is simple. You don't lose your temper when you're winning. You don't lash out when you're secure. You lost it because you know that your own contradictions are too heavy to carry." Gasps rippled through the room. Some in the audience shook their heads in disbelief, others leaned forward, grinning as if witnessing history. On social media, hashtags were already forming. Clips were already being clipped, and Crockett's words were being transcribed in real time. Sanders tried to counter, but it was too late. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that she had been outmaneuvered. Her face reddened, her words stumbled, her hand gestures flailed, as though trying to claw back control that had already slipped away. Each defensive word only reinforced Crockett's argument, that beneath the surface, Sanders was unraveling. And Crockett, she didn't gloat, she didn't mock. She simply sat back, steady as stone, letting Sanders' unraveling play itself out. That restraint was more powerful than any insult could have been. It was the difference between dignity and desperation, between someone who stood on truth and someone stumbling on spin. Then came Crockett's final blow, the line that would become the defining moment. "Governor Sanders," she said, her voice firm but calm. "Hypocrisy may win you applause in rooms where no one dares to challenge you, but in front of the American people, hypocrisy collapses. And today, it collapsed right here." The chamber erupted not in chaos, but in that unmistakable hum of history being made. Phones lit up, cameras zoomed in, reporters scribbled furiously. For viewers at home, it was the kind of moment that felt cinematic, almost scripted, yet undeniably real. The hero had delivered the mic drop and the villain had no answer. Sanders slumped slightly, her attempts at a comeback falling flat. The smirk was gone. The confidence that once defined her had evaporated. What remained was raw frustration, exposed for everyone to see. Crockett, by contrast, looked almost serene. She had done what she came to do. She had exposed the hypocrisy, not through volume, but through clarity. The power of the moment wasn't just in Sanders' unraveling, it was in what it represented. For years, voices like Crockett's had been drowned out, dismissed, or ignored. But here, in this chamber, under the bright lights, truth had landed, with undeniable force, and the people who had been waiting to see arrogance finally confronted felt vindicated. In living rooms, on smartphones, across timelines, people leaned forward. They shared the clip, replayed the words, texted, "Friends and family, you have to see this." It wasn't just political theater, it was a cultural earthquake. Sanders would recover her talking points later. She would retreat to friendlier outlets, rehearse a narrative of victimhood, try to spin herself back into control. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The mask had slipped, and the nation had seen the truth. And while Sanders lost her composure, what happened next made the moment go viral. The clash itself was seismic, but the aftershocks were even bigger. Within minutes of the exchange, clips of Jasmine Crockett's takedown began flooding timelines. Twitter lit up first. Hashtags like #SandersExposed and #CrockettClapback climbing the charts with lightning speed. The video was less than a minute long, but its impact was immediate. People weren't just watching, they were sharing, stitching, remixing, turning the moment into a cultural firestorm. On TikTok, creators added dramatic soundtracks under Crockett's final line, "Hypocrisy," collapses, cutting it with slow-motion shots of Sanders' visible frustration. On Instagram, meme pages exploded with side-by-side images, Sanders flailing in anger, Crockett.com, and Unshaken, captioned with phrases like "grace under fire" versus "fire without grace." For progressives, it was a rallying cry. For conservatives, it was a scramble to contain the damage. Cable news picked it up almost instantly. One network replayed the clip on loop with commentary about Sanders' meltdown, while another tried to paint Crockett as disrespectful. But the split coverage only fueled the fire online. Viewers weren't waiting for pundits to tell them what to think, they were making their own judgments, and the consensus was clear. Sanders had cracked, and Crockett had risen. Even late-night hosts joined in. Monologues mocked Sanders' unraveling, turning her lines into punchlines. While praising Crockett's composure as the mark of true leadership, the moment transcended politics. It became entertainment, a story that audiences craved because it was both dramatic and affirming. But beyond the laughter, there was something deeper. For many watching, Crockett's poise wasn't just was personal. Immigrant families saw in her a reflection of their own resilience. Young women of color saw themselves finally represented, not as side characters, but as the hero of the story. Activists who had spent years demanding accountability saw their frustrations validated on a national stage. This wasn't just a viral clip, it was an affirmation of identity and dignity. The ripple effect reached into politics too. Allies of Crockett flooded social media with praise, amplifying her voice. Sanders' allies, by contrast, fell into defensive silence or tried to spin the narrative, but the damage was already done. The footage spoke louder than any press release ever could. And then came the celebrities. Tweets from musicians, actors, and athletes added fuel to the fire. One wrote, "Jasmine Crockett just showed us how it's done." Another simply posted Crockett's mic drop line with a raised fist emoji. The cultural crossover ensured the clip would live far beyond political news cycles. It became part of pop culture itself. Meanwhile, Sanders faced the opposite reaction. Hashtags mocking her demeanor trended right alongside Crockett's praise. Satirical accounts exaggerated her meltdown, parodying her contradictions. Even some conservative commentators admitted, quietly, that she had lost her cool in a way that didn't bode well for her brand as a steady leader. The magnitude of the fallout revealed something crucial. This wasn't just about two politicians. It was about what they represented. Sanders' unraveling was read as the collapse of old politics, the politics of privilege, spin, and inherited power. Crockett's.com precision was seen as the rise of a new era, one grounded in authenticity, courage, and accountability. For viewers, that symbolism mattered as much as the spectacle itself. Watching Sanders lose, it wasn't just entertaining. It was cathartic. It was proof that hypocrisy doesn't last forever, that arrogance can be punctured, that someone willing to speak truth with composure can win against someone hiding behind bluster. And yet, beneath the memes and trending tags, something deeper was happening. It wasn't just about Crockett dismantling Sanders. It was about the audience seeing themselves in that victory, about people reclaiming faith that dignity could triumph. But beyond the memes and trending tags, there was something deeper. Beneath the noise of hashtags, the satire, and the endless replays, the moment crystallized into something larger than a viral clip. It became a parable about truth and hypocrisy, dignity and arrogance. People weren't just laughing at Sanders' meltdown, they were reflecting on what it meant Jasmine Crockett, by refusing to rise to Sanders' anger, had delivered a lesson in leadership that no soundbite could diminish. She showed that strength doesn't come from volume, but from clarity. That power isn't measured in titles or inherited privilege, but in the courage to confront dishonesty without losing yourself. In an age when politics often feels like a shouting match, her calm became revolutionary. For Sanders, the moment was a collapse. For Crockett, it was confirmation that the values she carried into politics were not just strategies, but shields. She embodied what many Americans have been desperate to see: someone who can stand in the storm without being consumed by it. Someone who can face hypocrisy without becoming hypocritical herself. The resonance went far beyond political tribes. Immigrant families who knew what it meant to fight for legitimacy saw themselves affirmed in Crockett's stance. Young progressives saw proof that the next generation of leaders didn't have to mirror the old guard. And communities that had felt invisible saw dignity standing tall in the face of arrogance. It wasn't about Democrat versus Republican, or even Texas versus Arkansas. It was about truth versus spin, service versus self-interest, courage versus cowardice. That's why the clip didn't just trend for a night, it lived on, replayed, quoted, turned into memes, not because it was funny, but because it was affirming. Crockett's composure gave people hope that politics could still be about something real, and the lesson rang clear. Hypocrisy always collapses under the weight of truth. No matter how carefully polished, no matter how loudly defended, lies cannot stand forever. Arrogance can dominate a room for a season, but dignity lasts. Crockett herself later reframed the confrontation, reminding supporters that this wasn't about her or Sanders, it was about values. It was about refusing to let dishonesty become normal. It was about standing firm, not for personal victory, but for everyone who has been silenced, dismissed, or underestimated. That humility only amplified the impact. For viewers, the moral of the story lingered long after the headlines faded. When dignity confronts arrogance, dignity wins. When truth faces hypocrisy, truth endures. When courage refuses to bend, it can break even the most carefully constructed facade. And as history looks back, this wasn't just a takedown, it was a warning. And so, this was the moment that instant Sarah Huckabee Sanders lost it, and Jasmine Crockett revealed what true leadership looks like. Not through shouting, not through spectacle, but through composure, precision, and an unshakable belief in dignity. For Sanders, it was a collapse. For Crockett, it was a rise. For the rest of us, it was a reminder that arrogance is temporary, but truth endures. Because this clash was never just about two politicians. It was about USAD, but the kind of country we want to build, the kind of voices we want to uplift, the kind of values we demand from those who claim to lead. It was about rejecting hypocrisy, no matter how powerful it appears, and embracing honesty, no matter how difficult it is to stand by. And here's the part that matters most. This isn't just Crockett's victory. It belongs to everyone who refuses to be silenced, to everyone who has ever faced arrogance and chosen dignity instead, to everyone who still believes that justice, courage, and truth can prevail in the public square. That's why this story has to be told, and retold, and shared. Because moments like this don't just pass, they become fuel. They remind us that every voice, every share, every conversation, carries weight. So if this story resonated with you, if you felt that spark of validation, that surge of pride, that reminder of what America can be, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Subscribe. Join this movement of truth-tellers and dignity, because hypocrisy will always try to roar louder. But together, we can make sure truth speaks longer. And in the end, that's the only legacy worth leaving.